Thanks so much for joining, Bhavik, and thanks everyone for tuning in. So this is a conversation of unfiltered conversations about intersectionality, and today we're going to be talking with Bhavik Shah as well. So Bhavik Shah is a principal at Mindshare Partners, leading impact-focused advising for companies on how to create a culture of support for mental health in the workplace. He's known for facilitating workplace training and leads strategic projects across a portfolio of clients focusing on improving mental health in the workplace. He spent his career in the financial services industry, delivering large programs across regulatory reform, technology, data analytics, and has worked across the US and UK with global clients to define business models, strategic program governance, implementation, and establishing operating models. So huge amounts of experience in the financial sector. But before joining Mindshare Partners, he successfully implemented a robust mental health program across a global workforce of 4,000 plus employees, is committed to providing pragmatic services through executive sponsorship and partnering with professionals as well. And prior to that as well, during his time in mental health, he served as the UK mental health lead and global advisor for other geographic areas. And this has resulted in Forbes recognition and nominations from organisations such as This Can Happen, Inside Out, Working Mums Make a Difference. He's also a public speaker focused on people engagement, mental health, technology and D&I, or diversity and inclusion, and is an alumni graduate of St John's University with a background in finance, and obviously a certified mental health first aider as well. So really excited to speak with you, Bhavik. It's such a great portfolio of work and things that you've been involved in. So yeah, is there anything that I've missed out before we start getting into the questions? If you just want to say hello.
No, I think that's great. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Great, thanks. So just to kind of ask about the first question is, I know we covered some of this just in your bio, or just kind of your intro here, but it'd be great to learn a little bit more about your background, how you kind of got into mental health, and particularly about maybe that link between diversity and inclusion and mental health, and where that kind of interest has come from.
Yep, sure. So I was born and raised in New York. That's where I'm at now. And coming from this sort of South Asian roots, my life experience has been mainly about being successful and doing that stereotypical model minority attributes of just assimilating and making sure that all my sort of accolades and achievements are focused on very much of like that status and reaching that status. So part of that really was very obvious to go into financial services because it just made the most sense and the family approved of it. But I think the more and more I spent time in there, I felt that there was something missing and that I was failing to sort of conform. And I struggled with that. And I struggled with that a lot actually at the workplace because there were a lot of times where I felt that I was doing something aligned with my values and aligned with how I saw things should be, and very, in a very managerial standpoint, how to take care of my team in certain difficult times. But there were times where it just conflicted with the company culture or conflicted with sort of society norms of how I should operate. So that led to like bouts of depression and really understanding how that, what I was doing was wrong, basically. And essentially that led me to a path of, addressing mental health at the workplace. So, by no means was it that easy of just like, realizing that right away. It took me a lot of therapy, a lot of self-care, a lot of conversations with close friends to really understand that mental health really shows up at different times in your life. We all have it and it's a spectrum. And I think for people who are in, the BAME network and have that diverse angle, it shows up very differently than what it would for the majority. And how we incorporate that within our day-to-day is super important, because I think I speak personally, I want to live my life in an authentic way.
When you kind of saw the links between mental health and diversity, and how you kind of came across, what were the kind of issues or the themes you kind of came across when you started to think about yourself as a South Asian man, thinking about mental health, and yeah, just kind of understanding some of those links from your own experience would be great.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, part of me, I always considered mental health a priority for me because I've gone through bouts of depression, and whether it was negative mental health or positive, it sort of has been always a priority for me. But I think once I went through sort of different sessions of therapy and really understanding why my uniqueness is really important at the workplace, I started being more observant of like the struggles that my other colleagues went through. And then we had very candid conversations about, how their experience and my experience was very similar and why we weren't getting to that step, why, having those leadership conversations became more tough, and why our managers were just not getting the conversation. There's a lot of conversations regarding like having gravitas and resilience, and those two words keep on coming up a lot in the financial services and maybe in different industries. But when you think about the intersectionality and sort of having those diverse identities, gravitas and resilience don't come naturally to a lot of us because we're not told to be leaders, we're told to assimilate. So that can be really triggering when someone from a hierarchical place, in our managers or our leaders telling us that we need to act a certain way. They don't understand that it doesn't come natural. And I think part of it is like, yes, we should be adapted to change and we should learn more and more, but it's hard. And I think providing a diverse workforce also should adapt to where people are coming from and how those experiences should be looked at when you're trying to, make us leaders and sort of, promote people in the right way, because you can't have a standard framework. It just doesn't work.
No, it's a really good point. And then it's really interesting to hear kind of about some of the challenges around mental health. And it's interesting to hear, actually, I think there's that perception of financial services where mental health just doesn't get spoken about, or is kind of either through self-medication or through just kind of, oh, it's just part of the job, it's part of the industry, which we kind of hear, it kind of becomes normalized in some way, but doesn't actually get dealt with, which I think is really fascinating. Is that something that you've come across as well, kind of thinking about mental health in some of the industries you've worked in, where depression has become normalized and that is kind of, they think as a leader, it's part of becoming a leader, it's part of that identity. I just wonder if that's something you come across.
Yeah, I think the culture of just working really hard and sort of this hustle mentality has gone out of control because there has to be a balance, right? Like whether you're a leader managing, thousands and thousands of people, or where you're just a, very middle type manager where you're managing a team of 5. If you're burning yourself out, one, it's not healthy for yourself, but then two, you're modeling really unhealthy behavior that your team must do the same in order to get to where you are. And there are organizations that will say, oh, it's not always the case. Every case is different. If we want to promote people, we must do this way. But by natural default, if I see my manager behaving, differently and working till 11 p.m. at night and sending emails at all costs, but also not standing up for their team and adjusting to the client's needs 24/7, I will automatically think that is the only way I will succeed, right?
Yeah.
And that's how that example will be leveraged as sort of a excuse for not to promote you if you don't do any of those. So
Yeah.
in financial services, it's very much like work hard, play hard, and that's always been the case. But that, to what extent is that going to really bring you a lot of success and joy, right? Like, yes, you may get the promotion, and a lot of people do. A lot of people get those promotions, and they really get, the money figure behind it. But what actually happens to your mental health, is that really the point of all of this, right? Can't financial services firms still find a balance of working, working hard, but still looking after yourself? I think there is. And if the pandemic has shown us anything, is that there is power to flexibility and there's power to actually understanding where someone is coming from. But there's still very much of a stigma behind, if you're talking about mental health, or if you say you need a mental health day, then you're perceived as weak or incompetent, or that you're not able to take on an extra load of work. Whereas in fact, research shows that a person struggling with a mental health challenge can be as successful as someone without a mental health challenge. It's just the perception is there, and unfortunately, we need to work towards to remove that stigma.
No, that's really helpful. And just thinking about actually the because you've worked across the UK and the US. Have you worked in any other countries in this kind of area or?
No, I've only worked
Okay.
in the UK and the US.
Okay, and just in terms of like, I guess that question of thinking about mental health across the Atlantic, I guess in some ways, has
Yeah.
there been any significant, like similar issues or kind of similarities that you kind of think, oh, this is, this is definitely something beyond just the country or just one
Yeah.
country? I just wonder if what your experience of that has been kind of coming from the UK, and particularly because did you move back home to the States during the pandemic? Is that right?
Yeah.
Or
About a year ago.
okay, and I just wonder if there's been any any kind of differences around mental health from the UK and in contrast to the US during this pandemic. I wonder.
Yeah. I think part of it is that the UK is a bit more advanced in having those conversations. I would think the last 5, 6 years, I would say UK is a lot more advanced. Maybe that's because, you've had those very candid conversations with a lot of organizations and nonprofits who are working towards erasing the stigma in the UK, whereas the US is still playing a bit of a catch up. I will say that the pandemic has heightened a lot of that, conversation and sort of brought the positive experiences of talking about mental health to the forefront. But there's still a lot that the US needs to change, in my
Indeed.
personal opinion. It's just work-life balance is still very much of an issue. I would
Sure.
say there no matter the flexibility is obviously there right now because it's remote working, but people are still working until like 9, 10 o'clock at night. And I think in the UK, there might be some examples like that. And by no means am I saying that it just doesn't happen, but I think people just understand the personal need of taking a step back and sort of
Mm,
the the experience of taking care of your family or your loved ones. Whereas the US, there's this sort of innate fear of like if you don't work this hard, you will lose your job, or they
wow.
won't require you to get you to that next promotion or whatever. So that job security and job promotion and sort of success
Yeah.
factor is still prevalent in the US, and I see it across different family members and friends, and it's something that needs to change, and I'm seeing small changes here and there, but I think it's just the way the US has always, been. Historically, we've always had that sort of, like I said, hustle mentality and sort
Sure.
of like, all financial services is like the Wolf of Wall Street type of thing. And then you have like different stereotypes for media and fashion. And I think a
Right.
lot of this needs to change, but it's hard because it's so ingrained in our culture. Like our holidays are, average of 10 days for the year,
Wow.
which just, some companies have obviously taken, a different route, and the tech boom
Yeah.
with Silicon Valley is obviously 20, 30 days, et cetera. But
Sure.
the majority of it, it's hard to still change that, day to day.
Yeah. No, that's it's fascinating, but I think you already touch upon some of like the intersectionality aspects of it. That there's this kind of hustle mentality, or this hustle culture, but then also the system doesn't enable people to have equal kind of holiday leave. It varies from institution to institution, that people experience mental health differently. So already there's like these kind of intersecting complexities around this issue of just mental health altogether. And that kind of comes through in what you're saying already. I just wonder, now that you've kind of transitioned more, so are you working in mental health full time now? Is that kind of the main focus of your work in that
Correct. Yeah.
respect? Okay,
Yep. I'm working for a nonprofit that focuses strictly on mental health
right,
at the workplace.
great. And then it'd be great to hear about when was the kind of like the first time you heard about intersectionality? When did you kind of meet intersectionality in that respect? And
Yeah.
yeah, it'd be great to hear about that.
I would say about 2 years ago, I was still working in London, and at that time, I just started my mission in changing mental health at the workplace in my last company. And the more and more I did research about intersectionality, I was intrigued by it, but I felt heard and seen in ways where before a lot of people didn't feel comfortable in talking about it. And I think still generally now people are okay to talk about mental health and they sort of see the need for it. I would say a lot more people have seen the light in this pandemic. But when you talk about diversity and when you talk about what people need, and it still feels uncomfortable for some. When there obviously there's been so much in the last year that we've seen on the news and we've experienced through the the increased crimes against the Black Americans, and even the BAME network in the UK, but then also the crimes against East Asians here, the AAP community in the US. Because of the pandemic, people are blaming the Asian community because it's just something that hatred and violence has sort of brought to us. It's important to think about how that affects us at the workplace. Like if you're constantly thinking about what your community is going through and you know what you have to go through as part of being in that community, that trauma and that sort of that triggering point, how can you be productive and really successful at work? And yes, as a workplace and as a leader, as a manager, you can't change necessarily all of that, but you can put in methods and sort of practices in place that will support your employees. And that's sort of that intersectionality point is really important because that's what I needed 2 years ago. I didn't necessarily need a specific framework for just me as a South Asian man navigating financial services who had depression in his life, but then also is trying to like make a better world in mental health. It's more about, I think all of our personal experiences are really important to be considered, and there needs to be a different lens on how workplaces address intersectionality. And it's just not, diverse cultures. You're looking at the LGBTQ plus community. You're looking at, neurodiversity. You're looking at able versus disabled, and that aspect of just living that life on a day-to-day basis, but then also going through a very, conformative majority atmosphere. What are those angles? How does that play into each other on a day-to-day basis? It's super important to think about.
Yeah, and I think there's that negotiation of all those different components, which makes intersectional thinking quite challenging in some ways.
Yeah.
And it can be quite difficult to kind of bring down to something tangible, something that could be applied. I was wondering, have you kind of perhaps used or kind of applied this sort of intersectional thinking in your own work around mental health or the way you think about mental health? Because it sounds like it was something that was really, really useful for you to kind of make sense of your own experiences. But it also sounds like it's been a way in which has been quite useful for you in terms of how you work with others as well. So I just wondered what your kind of reflections are around that as well.
Yeah, I think part of this, and to answer that question, I think it goes back to sort of allyship in one way. I always think about allyship, and I always think about how myself and so many other great advocates and the colleagues that I work for are always trying to make change. But at the end of the day, change is going to really make an impact if there's allyship from the majority. And when I speak majority, I'm talking about like the white Americans or the Caucasians or the people who really have fit the mold for a really long time. And I think there are some people who are really eager and they understand what needs to happen, but the other part of it is that they need to have uncomfortable conversations with us and really ask, like, what is it that really gives you stress and what bothers you? What can I learn from your experiences to make a very inclusive environment for not only for us but for future generations to come, right? So I think for me, how I approach allyship is really important, and how others approach allyship is different as well. But in general, we sort of have to encourage others to really see the allyship differently, because they might just say, yes, I don't stand up for racism, or I don't stand up, I stand against microaggressions or discrimination at the workplace. But what does that really mean? Are you really thinking about it from our lens? And that's what I really want to encourage people to think. How you show up for an ally should be different than what you have been doing before, because there's obviously a gap and something's missing. So we want to bridge that gap, right?
Yep. No, that's great, and I really kind of like appreciate that kind of focus on collective action, participatory action, these models of allyship, because it is everyone. Race equality is everyone's issue, it's everyone's problem. We all need to work together to address it and dismantle racial inequalities and inequalities more broadly as well. So I think that allyship piece is really interesting. I know there's quite a lot of kind of mental health teams and well-being teams in different organizations that sometimes struggle to integrate intersectionality or integrate sort of diverse and inclusive thinking and models into their kind of work. And there's in previous organizations I've worked in, there's always been this kind of constant debate around how do we think about diversity and inclusion in the mental health kind of forum, in the well-being? How do we practice that as a team? I was wondering if you have any kind of, not any secrets that I need to give away or anything, but just kind of any kind of experiences or thoughts you've had, or what kind of challenges that you've faced in terms of thinking about that bridge between mental health diversity in the kind of organizational context that you can share.
Yeah, I think part of it is that it can't be sort of a one-time exercise. So, I've seen that across organizations pre-pandemic and now even during the pandemic that they try to bridge two affinity groups together, whether that's neurodiversity, or able versus disabled, or mental health across different minority groups. And they do like an event, they do a panel event, they may have conversations, newsletters sent out. They may have those proclamations, sent across the different workforces after like a really tragic event has happened in the news. But then what? Like that doesn't work, right? Like having that one-time event really loses credibility in my point of view from different leaders and different managers. So I think the first step is really to have a consistent strategy behind it. And what that means may look different for different types of organizations and different types of people, but you have to think long term because eventually we want to reach a point where you don't need to have these panel events or you don't need to talk about it because it's so intertwined with the company culture that it becomes second nature. Maybe very similar to how organizations will have a very robust onboarding program or will have the engagement section of like having fun events like town halls or drinks or socials or whatever that may be. This needs to be incorporated in that part of that strategy and that people strategy because there are all different types of people, and if you cater to the diverse workforce once a year or every time something happens in the news but then sort of dwindle down, it's not going to really make a long-term effect or impact. So that's one. I think consistency is key. And then secondly, it's having those uncomfortable conversations because as my own unique identity of, being South Asian and being, having mental health issues but now advocating for them, I don't understand everything and nor will I ever try. But I think I accept that, right? I need to obviously, have conversations with different minority groups or different majority groups to understand their point of view. Are people having those same conversations? And as from an organization standpoint, as CEOs, leaders, are you having those conversations? Because you may not have the answer for everything, and that's perfectly okay. But you still need to learn and educate yourself on what you can do. Because there's clearly a problem. And I think we've been all really we've been really good at identifying the problem. But now we need to start thinking about what are the solutions there that we need to put in practice. And that's part of it.
No, that's really great. And I know a lot of people kind of talk about uncomfortable conversations and disruptive conversations or constructively disruptive conversations. I guess what does an uncomfortable conversation mean to you and to the work that you do? It'd be great to get your thoughts on that.
Yep. I think, so it's twofold. I would think one is that there has to be a sort of an human element and empathy factor into everything that's happening in the world. Like it's not only just addressing it, but really asking your teams on the ground and really understanding how are they actually handling and coping with everything. Because if you just take the last 14 months as an example, you're dealing with a global pandemic and the stress and anxiety related to that. You're looking at social injustice issues with race and inequality and sort of hate crimes against all different communities. And then you're looking at isolation and a lot of rise in mental health issues from, not seeing family, grief. A lot of people have lost loved ones. So the uncomfortable conversation is really what can we do as an organization to make sure that you're supported, but also realizing that we're not therapists, we're not, clinicians. We're not going to be able to solve the issues, but just having that very candid conversation of,
Yeah.
you know, we understand that these past 14 months have been really difficult. And if you know someone who has gone through previous experiences as a manager, and you know that the social and, you know, economic situations of different people are affecting that person, ask that question. Like, you know,
Yeah.
like, hey, you know, the news has really alarming and disturbing. How does that resonate with you? Are you coping well? So part of that is knowing your boundaries, right? Knowing your boundaries, that you should say something, but
Mhm.
obviously don't solutionize and don't try
Yeah.
to, you know, make it all better. And then the other part of uncomfortable conversation is the culture behind, you know, a lot of the intersectionality conversations that I have had with myself and other people at different
Mhm.
organizations is that, as a employee, do you feel seen? And is your entire being seen? Meaning, like, do you know what you need to do as a diverse workforce to get to the next level? Or do you know what you need to do to get to the, you know, the level that you aspire to? Or are we all just evaluating people at the same framework?
Mhm.
And the framework is designed by, you know, the whole thing I was talking about, resilience and gravitas and stuff that doesn't come naturally to a lot of people. But like, are we doing them injustice by just saying, well, that's the framework, that's what you need to do? And if you don't like it, then, you know, that's just the culture of the company. So the second part of this uncomfortable conversation, and this
Okay.
long-winded way of saying, is that you need to sort of do an evaluation on your culture, an
Yeah.
evaluation of, like, is your culture inclusive across all bands? Not just saying, hey, we hire people from different ethnicities and different affinity groups so we could put a poster board on, you know, the company
Mhm.
website. That's not diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion is thinking like them and adapting different ways and taking the strengths from different areas to really incorporate within your day-to-day practices. So it becomes part of the DNA in a way.
That's really interesting, and I think it also touches upon that. Mental health and well-being is across the hierarchy, and it's also it's across the hierarchy in multiple different ways. And that kind of understanding, appreciating the individual as one whole person, or one whole community in some ways. Really just going to shed light on that, which is really fascinating. I just wonder as well, we know that, for example, particularly with the pandemic, has had a disproportionate impact on Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities, definitely in the UK, and I assume in the US as well in some ways. But I'm not as knowledgeable of the disproportionate impact. In terms of like some of those kind of physical health inequalities, have you noticed any kind of thing or any significant changes, I guess, in some way in terms of mental health and well-being, perhaps from the UK and or the US kind of context?
Changes in a positive light, you mean? For, like, the better? You
Yeah,
great.
or yeah, if it's kind of like I guess if there's been an increase of certain kind of mental health, or an increase in demand for mental health, or widely understanding mental health, or there's increase in kind of specific issues or kind of disorders, I guess, in some ways that you've kind of been more exposed to since the onset of the pandemic. I wasn't sure if you could speak to some of that experience.
Yeah, I can't speak to, like, all the communities, but I can say from, you know, from myself and, like, the South Asian community. I think, you know, from the US, as last year's events have unfolded, I think a lot of us have felt different avenues of stress and anxiety, and sort of understanding that maybe fitting this mold of just assimilation and being successful is not worth it, you know, because we've seen a lot of loss and grief this past year, and our mental health as a whole has been affected. But
Mm,
then, you know, for me, I've looked at what does that really mean with the life that I've been leading, you know, the last 33 years or so forth. And the last 2, 3 years I'm very proud of, but I think part of it is just always looking at, I've felt a lot of the stress because I did assimilate and I did think about, like, you know, what's really important, um, to be successful. So I
mm,
think with the pandemic, it's really shed a light on a lot of that doesn't really matter, you know, anymore. And I
yeah,
think we need to have perspective on really what really is important in that sense. And what I would really like to promote is that a lot of people need to think about that this role that we've been assigned to play in the grander scheme of life and society is not something that we chose to play. It was sort of given to us, and in some ways forcefully. And I hope that the the mental health of the community as a whole, day by day is getting better, right? Because a lot of this can really cause a lot of trauma, like for myself, and other people that I've talked to that are close to me. It can really, drain you in
Yeah.
ways. And sometimes we don't even understand why, because we're not so self-aware about a lot of these things.
Mm.
So these are some of the changes. I can't speak to a lot of other stuff, but I can really speak from my community and it's like what I've been feeling.
Yeah, I think it's a really fair point, and it definitely kind of resonates with some of the experiences that I myself have had, and I myself suffer with an anxiety disorder. So I've definitely been much more kind of, the distractions aren't there with the pandemic, like the things that we would usually do to kind of have as an outlet, or particularly for myself with sort of generalized anxiety, to have those things as an outlet, they aren't there. So you have to, one, be even more creative than than you
Right.
possibly could think of. But also there's that aspect of, you become even more kind of like in tune with your own anxiety issues when it's kind of at, 10 out of 10 or 1 out of 10 or whatever. And those things are really kind of, you become, it's almost like sometimes you feel like you're going backwards in some
Yeah,
ways,
yeah, exactly.
because you've become so in tune with your mental health. It's kind of irritating sometimes in that
Yeah.
aspect. Um, that's really helpful, and I think it's also kind of speaking in terms, it does kind of resonate being South Asian myself as well. That kind of assimilation piece, that kind of, the kind of innate pressure you have, sometimes to be perceived as successful or have some weird vision of success, whatever that looks like in your parents' eyes or family's eyes and stuff. So definitely, definitely, I'll share that sentiment in some ways.
Yeah.
Um, you talked a bit about kind of like having conversations about intersectionality. And I just wondered, has that kind of presented any challenges, in terms of helping people understand what it is? Or some people have actually kind of said, they're quite afraid of intersectionality, or they, because of it coming from like kind of, dismantling white privilege and white fragility and those kinds of things. I wondered, how you've kind of had those conversations about intersectionality, and how you've perhaps overcome any, misunderstanding or sometimes resistance, I guess, in that way.
It's interesting you asked that question, because I think there are only a few people who I've actually spoken to about my views on intersectionality that share the same view and opinion. Others, I think it's really hard for them to see the viewpoint, because dismantling white privilege and dismantling anything that is associated with that is a really hard challenge to take on, really. And I think
Mm,
some people don't think in the aspect of that change is really necessary. So sort of, having those conversations, and you have to like preach and preach, and hopefully they understand the song and message. But one of the toughest challenges I've had is to have with like certain close friends about, if we all sort of just go on our merry way and continue to do what we've been told and we've been sort of trained to do, nothing will change, right? And I think
mm,
part of it is, being bold enough to make that change. And I don't think a lot of people see it that way. I don't think a lot of people see it as a problem, which, I think that's sort of the challenge that I'm seeing with intersectionality, is that there are people who are really courageous and really bold. And I'm not talking about myself, because I don't think I'm that bold or courageous. I'm talking about like people like you, who've been doing this for a really long time, or other advocates who have, dedicated their entire life's work to this. Um, they're courageous and bold, and we need people like that so we can reference and sort of advocate with. But then there are others who just do not think that this is a priority, and they do not want to take participation in it. So
mm,
it's sort of understanding that that's a challenge there as well. That if you're advocating for the communities, but half the community doesn't agree with you, then where do you bring them to the journey? Or how do you bring them along?
mm. Yeah, I think that's the, something that I've kind of learned as well, is that it's that almost like coaching support, or that kind of developmental kind of piece. Um, I know, other kind of anti-racist activists do kind of, I don't want to say shock tactics, but are probably more forthcoming, more kind of direct about their approach. And for me personally, I definitely find that when it comes to intersectionality, it seems similar to yourself, is that more kind of coaching, the nudging, the kind of pastoral kind of journey, and then kind of hand holding in some ways works quite well, particularly with leaders and different individuals in some ways. But it's interesting that you talk about kind of challenges with close friends. I've definitely myself have felt um, in some ways kind of felt it's almost more difficult to have those conversations with close friends. I don't know if
Yeah.
you've had that as well. Even though it's so much easier to talk to like a CEO from somewhere, but even like your best friend, it's like this feels weird. So,
Yeah, it feels weird, and then also I think when it's someone who's a stranger, you kind of have to say your piece, and you just hope that they understand it. When you have friends and family that you would hope they see your viewpoint, I think your expectations are a bit higher. So it's probably just managing your own expectations. Of like, well, why don't you see this? Why do you not see that this is important? Because
yeah,
we're all sort of in the same boat in different ways, but the journey has been somewhat similar. So I would hope that they can see where I'm coming from. But I think people are on different wavelengths. And like you said, there is probably an element of coaching and hand holding that really would be required to kind
yeah.
of get the movement going in some ways.
And just out of curiosity, so one of the things I've noticed, particularly my parents, they come from an older generation, and they've definitely been much more kind of open about talking about intersectionality, which I would never have thought they would have ever said that word to me in my entire life. But they have actually asked about intersectionality. They've asked about anti-racism. They've asked about some of these kind of new languages that they didn't really grow up with. I just wondered, and from your perspective, have you noticed a shift in kind of the conversations with your family around the events of last year and how that's maybe kind of shifted or hasn't shifted in some ways? I just was quite curious to know
Yeah.
if that's been a similar thing.
So it's very similar to your parents. My parents come from an older generation.
Yeah.
And I would say, one thing that they've always taught my brother and I is that, have that human empathy, right? Like be kind to other people. But
Mhm.
with everything that's happened last year, I think that sort of come to the forefront. And my parents have actually asked now, like, wait, why is this actually happening? Like, why did this person, suddenly, I mean, whatever the case, like with George Floyd, like, why did that happen? Why did the police officer do this and do that? And I don't think they understand how powerful hatred is. But it's
Mm.
really nice for them to ask those types of questions
Yeah.
because I think before, everyone's sort of wrapped up in doing their own thing and being more successful and becoming, the the successful person in their family and sort of just aiming for their own um, sort of challenges. But
Yeah.
I think now looking at the entire sort of realm of society and looking at what's happening in other communities, having that inquisitive mindset is, I think, a super progressive thing to do, especially from people who are in their 70s and standing that like life is actually really tough for a lot of people, and we may not understand all of it, but it is nice to see, and I wish other people would have those very uncomfortable conversations with their parents and grandparents
Yeah.
who still may not think that this is a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it. It's been really reassuring to kind of, particularly for my parents, to actually hear them ask questions about it, which I never thought we'd be able to have those conversations. And that curiosity has been sparked by last year and more events for the Black Lives Matter movements last year, and also recently we've had in the UK. I don't know if you're aware, but a race commission report was released by the UK government, and even having a conversation with parents about that report was just kind of really, it was quite nice to be able to talk to them about these things. It's nice to have that it's a conversation that we can have now,
Yeah,
when it was so silent before in some ways.
yeah,
But it's interesting to see that that's kind of similar with your family as well in that respect too. Um, I just wanted to ask as well, kind of finally around what your sort of kind of you've worked across different industries, and particularly the financial services industry, which is always kind of got a stereotype for having poor mental health as an industry in itself. And I do think, you described like the Wolf of Wall Street, and I think that's probably my stereotype of financial services in some ways, which I know is not particularly accurate, but I think that there's a golden nugget there. There's a nugget of truth there, I think, in some respects. But you've worked across financial services. You've been now kind of really invested in mental health more prominently, and also think about intersectionality, diversity, and inclusion in the conversations you have, and then the people and the organisations you work with. What would be kind of sort of your kind of take-home messages, perhaps around bringing all these things together, the things that you've learned over your journey, and the work that you've done personally and professionally as well? What would be kind of your take-home messages around this for people that are looking to integrate intersectionality or diversity into mental health, or perhaps messages for organisations that maybe need to do more in some ways? It'd be great to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I could have like two different answers to that. One from like an individual perspective, and then I guess probably one from a organization perspective. I guess from the individual perspective, I have, the last couple of years have always really looked at saying one thing: use your voice. Like, feel empowered to use your voice, because just from my last corporation, starting a mental health program from scratch and sort of a grassroots initiative, it really is astonishing how much it, became a worldwide program and looking to service about 5,000 people globally, where
Wow.
all I wanted to do was really think about how to support my team of 8 people. And that's how the idea started, and it sparked sort of a revolution within a company of talking about mental health more and thinking about it from a more of an inclusive perspective. And it wouldn't have happened if I felt that my voice didn't matter. And it wasn't easy always. There were people there that were naysayers and had doubts, and they definitely thought that this would not go as far as it did, but it ended up being a really amazing program to get external recognition, award nominations, and also just the impact that I saw day in and day out from people that I worked with, and that I would see the stats of who used the program all anonymously, but just it increasing month by month over the last 2 years was just
Wow.
amazing. And that comes to the fact that people are a lot more resilient than they think they are. And if everyone sort of stood up for one thing that they really did believe in and sort of just block out the noise, they could really accomplish a lot of things. So hopefully that is empowering. That I wasn't a CEO or a senior manager. I was like a very mid-level manager. And I just decided to go for it. So hopefully that can empower other people who have ideas to do that. And I think from an organization standpoint, it's sort of the opposite end of that spectrum, is that it can't just always be people on the ground doing the work. Like, from an organization and leadership standpoint, this needs to be incorporated within your people strategy and looked at of, if people are your main revenue model, how do you support that people? Because as humans, we all are exceptions, and there need to be exceptions to the playbook and to the rule book. And there is no one shoe fits all. But if you consistently think about your revenue and strictly just think about getting your numbers across the board, then you're not going to be able to sustain a culture where it should be inclusive across all different types of people. So the more they realize that there is an added benefit, a business benefit, to incorporate mental health at the workplace and diversity and inclusion at the workplace, the more they'll realize that there's actually more power into having an inclusive workforce.
I love that. I love that kind of real focus on user voice, and then just voice in general. It can be, people kind of say that empowering voices can be too laborious and too time, but it's such an important part of embedding and integrating that kind of inclusive approach to the things that we do. And also ties in, it's phenomenal the work you've done so far, and it's incredible, which is great to hear that you've been able to support so many people through what seems like quite a small program when it started, which is great. And that it's kind of come to support organizations and helping them understand why it's so important as well, which I think is really empowering. So that voice aspect, I think, is so crucial, and it's such a central part of intersectionality. It's about understanding experience, how to translate that into action. I think that's something that you've achieved, which is really great to hear. And yeah, this has been such a wonderful conversation with you, Bhavik. It's been so interesting to hear about your experience and talking openly about your own personal experiences and how you brought that into the professional realm as well.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's been great just talking about a lot of this stuff, and it's amazing that we're on the same page for a lot of it.